Hi, I'm Jonathan Jones, the Provident Prepper. Today we're talking about fuels. As we all know, fuels are critical for transportation, for our generators, for cooking, for heating, and it's important that we understand how to store these fuels.
Storing fuel can be a dangerous proposition. The very attributes that make fuel such a valuable tool also makes it very dangerous to store.
That's right. So today we will talk about how to store fuel safely and legally so that you can have this resource when you need it most. Let's talk about how to safely store popular emergency fuels. This picture shows a home that went up in flames in our hometown here, and it was really a very sad deal. There was accelerants in the garage. I don't know that they really know what happened, but it did turn into a fire that completely ruined the house.
This video is based off of a post that we did. Google the Provident Prepper, where can I safely store popular fuels for emergencies? Because we just barely skimmed the surface with this, but if you go there, you'll be able to get a whole lot more details. One of the most important things that you can do is to store your fuel safely. The best place to do that is in a detached shed. We want something that is away from your home so that if there is an accident, your whole home doesn't go up with it. So the best guideline we can give to you is never store fuel in a building that you can't afford to have burned down.
Now, in an ideal situation, this shed would be somewhat insulated to protect it from the highs and lows. It is much better for your fuel and for safety purposes if you can have something where that temperature is moderated, that you don't go from really highs in the summer to really cold in the winter, but you have to do the best you can with what you've got.
But one of the really good things that this shed has going for it is lots of good ventilation, and fuel needs lots of ventilation.
That is right. We encourage you to look at the safety data sheets.
What's a safety data sheet?
A safety data sheet is a document that is prepared by the manufacturers of the fuels, and this provides you with information on the safety aspects, how to store a fuel, what the risks are with that fuel, and how you mitigate those risks. And we really strongly encourage you to look at those so that you understand exactly what you're dealing with.
And the section we want you to pay special attention to, because otherwise you'll fall asleep because they're really long and boring. If you look over on the left-hand side, conditions for safe storage, including incompatibilities, that's going to tell you exactly how to store the fuel that you are questioning. And that's really important because every fuel is just a little bit different and we want to do it safely, and you don't want to store that fuel next to something that's going to make it blow up.
Well stated. Gasoline is a great fuel. Obviously, we use it for all kinds of things, for cars, for generators, but it has to be stored in a well-ventilated area, and it has to be stored in approved containers. Don't ever store your fuels in something that is not meant to store that fuel. Keep it away from ignition sources. Stay within the legal limits. We always encourage you to stay within your legal limits and to make sure that you store safely. And gasoline should be rotated every 9 to 12 months. Now, you can add a fuel stabilizer and extend that longer, but it's best if you can just keep it rotated. And I encourage you to use a fuel stabilizer even if you're just going to rotate it every 9 to 12 months. It helps that fuel just stay a little bit better. We encourage you to Google the Provident Prepper Safe Emergency Fuel Storage Guidelines.
And that will help you understand the legal limits for what you can store. It is only for one area, but if you have any questions, you can always contact your local fire department to make sure that you are storing your fuel legally.
In certain instances, if you are storing fuels beyond the legal limits or outside of safe practices, that can negate your homeowner's insurance. So you need to make sure that whatever you do, you store legally and safely and with good judgment. Now, Bob here, he created a setting for his fuel storage that we thought was unique and kind of interesting.
It was ingenious, actually. He had a need, he looked at his option, and he was creative in coming up with a unique solution.
Right. This buried freezer has ventilation on both sides, and it provides a safe storage place for the fuel. It's up off the floor of the freezer. It's on these little pallets that allow some airflow. and it just provides a really safe environment for this fuel to be stored.
One of the problems is static buildup. You don't want to have a problem with static, and keeping those up on that little pallet, it helps to reduce the static buildup.
Diesel is another good fuel that you can use. A lot of people have diesel generators and obviously diesel vehicles. It stores similar to gasoline. It should be rotated every 6 to 12 months, and again, there are stabilizers that you can use to help extend the life of that. Diesel has a little bit of a problem in that it gels in the cold temperatures, and so you need to be aware of that. It should always be stored in the approved containers. Generally, those are a yellow container, but make sure that you store that in a appropriate container and that you store it safely.
Kerosene is actually a great storage fuel. It needs to be stored in a cool, well-ventilated location, and always in either the original container that you purchased it in or in blue, specially designed containers for kerosene storage. Store it away from strong oxidizers, and it has a 5-year shelf life, which can be extended with fuel stabilizers. And so that's one of the reasons why it's a really good fuel. It's not explosive like gasoline is, so it's a little bit safer.
Coleman Fuel, again, this stores similar to gasoline. It should be stored in the original container. If that container has been opened, you're going to have a fairly short shelf life. But if it is unopened, you've got a good 2-year shelf life. It should again be stored in a detached shed or an outbuilding, someplace where you can store that safely.
Butane cartridges. Now, butane is very much like propane in the fact that it has an indefinite shelf life. The problem with butane cartridges is that the can itself will degrade over time and may release the butane. Now, butane is heavier than air. It just finds this nice little low-lying spot and will hang out there until there's an ignition source and it will explode. So you have to be very careful about butane leaks. Don't ever store it in your basement. And it needs to be stored in a cool location, something that doesn't get over 122 degrees. A garage is really not the best choice because sometimes your garage can get very hot. And you need to store it in a well-ventilated location. After one of our classes, a lady came up to tell us how she had been storing her butane cartridges, and she's been storing them in 5-gallon buckets in the garage. Now, there's 2 problems that we see with this. The first problem is that a sealed 5-gallon bucket is not well ventilated, and that's one of the first requirements. The second is that it's in the garage, and garages get very hot in the summer depending on where you live. That probably isn't an optimal way to store those cartridges.
Propane canisters are a great tool for your heating and other devices. Again, these small containers, the seals tend to degrade over time, and that is the main concern with these, is just the fact that those seals do start decomposing. Propane is heavier than air, and so it does pose some kind of an explosive risk if that fuel is allowed to fall into a low-lying area and provide an explosive risk. These again should be stored in a ventilated area.
The propane tanks are a much higher quality and are not at risk for leakage the same way that the propane canisters are. Propane has an indefinite shelf life. It should be stored in a well-ventilated area, and avoid excessive temperatures, and make sure that you're storing it in approved containers. But it is just a fantastic way to store your fuel. An idea that one gentleman in our class had was to store propane canisters in a deck box. And we thought this actually is a really great idea because a lot of times you can't store that many in your garage, and you don't want them just sitting in the sun and in the open weather, and everybody doesn't have a shed. So he proposed that you put one of these underneath at some type of a shady location so that it's out of direct sun. The one thing we thought of is you really have to provide some ventilation. That is one of the major things that the manufacturer recommends. So I would drill large holes in each side of this, in the base, towards the base, because if there's some leakage, that way the propane will actually leak out and will not pool inside of that. But what a great option, depending on how large this deck box is. You could store 5, 6, I don't know how many.
Possibly up to 8 in some of these deck boxes.
And your tanks are protected from the weather.
We highly recommend that you look at alcohol as a potential fuel for indoor use for cooking and for heating. Here we show Everclear, which is a grain alcohol, and also the denatured alcohol in its different forms or presentations here. It goes by several different names, but they do the same thing, and it's a very, very good fuel. These store very nicely in their cans.
We also classify Safe Heat in the same category with the alcohol. These are 6-hour cans, are made of an kind of an alcohol gel formulation. All of this alcohol has an indefinite shelf life. The chafing dish is probably more 10-ish. The fuel's not explosive. It's safe to burn it indoors as long as you have adequate ventilation. And it's safe to store indoors as long as you're limited to reasonable quantities. It has a really low ignition temperature, which means that it catches on fire at a very low temperature. But it is not explosive like gasoline or some of the other fuels are.
Here you can see some experimenting that we did with several of these fuels. You can see the Everclear and the denatured alcohol. Also, we had isopropyl alcohol in the Safe Heat. And we were conducting just some tests to look at cost and effectiveness. And you can get the results of that from the Provident Prepper, Best Alcohol Cooking Fuels for Campers and Preppers. Some interesting information there.
Isopropyl alcohol is not one of the best alcohol fuels. It will work, but we recommend if you're storing that you store denatured alcohol or one of the other forms of alcohol in place of isopropyl.
You can see here a really great solution for fuel storage if you've got a lot of money. They are very expensive. You can look them up online or at specialty stores, but they are very expensive, but they do provide an excellent place for fuel storage. That's what they're meant to do. We do encourage you to look at the Provident Prepper, How to Safely Store Fuel for Emergencies, and you've got some great information there. Take a look at your needs. What would you need to get you through for some cooking and some heating to get you through an emergency? Figure out what that might look like and figure out how you can store that safely and legally. Obviously, you don't need this much fuel. Having some fuel on hand is really important for an emergency. We encourage you to look at the Provident Prepper Action Plan, Fuel Safety and Storage. This provides a framework to get you started with your fuel storage and allows you to look at your options and figure out what is going to work best for you and your family.
Go to the Provident Prepper, How to Safely Store Fuel for Emergencies, and you will learn an awful lot about fuels and how to store them, more fuels than what we discussed here. The other place that I'd tell you to look at is a post that we did on where can I safely store popular fuels for emergencies. And that is the post that this video was based off of it, but it has so much more detail than what we were able to provide you with here.
Right.
Do you have any fuels stored incorrectly?
Today is a great day to evaluate your fuel storage and make sure that you and your family are safe from good intentions.
And now for the question of the day. What great ideas do you have for our viewers to safely store fuel for emergencies? Comment below.
And thanks for being part of the solution.